So, in addition to the positive things that are going on in our lives, chances are that you are experiencing some of what political scientists call polarization. And it seems to be getting uglier. And the thing about polarization is that it's connected with the curve of equality, economic equality. So the more inequality that we have in our society, the more polarization that we have. And since everything's set up in our society now, in our economy, for there to be more and more economic inequality, even though it's already in historical proportions, but things are set up to make it even more unequal here. So what we can expect is even more polarization. So that sounds like really horrible news. Am I right? Yes, yes, yes. Everybody I know in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from, is down in the dumps about this polarization. And I was too, until I was doing the research on the Nordic countries, on Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. And I found a very surprising thing, that it was in the period, let's take Norway and Sweden since their struggles were more parallel than the others. In Norway and Sweden, in the 1920s and 30s, they encountered the biggest polarization that they had ever had in their history. I mean, we're talking about serious polarization. Nazis on the march, in their streets, swastikas, shouting horrible anti-Semitic slogans, racist slogans. And on the other hand, the other extreme, communists organizing dictatorship of the proletariat. I would say that's a pretty big spectrum, right? Wouldn't you? And that was also the period, the 20s and the 30s, when they made their breakthrough, pushed the economic elite aside, created the space that they could create what economists now call the Nordic economic model, which delivers more equality and shared prosperity and individual freedom than nations have ever been able to generate in history. So they had this massive breakthrough at the time when you would think the polarization would prevent any forward motion at all. So that, I thought, was a very interesting mystery. Maybe the data were wrong. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Until I remembered, wait a minute, what was going on in the decade I was born in my country, the 1930s? I was born in the 30s. Well, what was going on there? Tremendous polarization. My dad told me later about there was a priest on the radio, weekly programs, preaching fascism. Widely listened to. The Nazis were strong in the United States. The anti-Semitism was so extreme that the United States made it a national policy. We will not accept Jews fleeing from Germany, fleeing the Holocaust. We will not do that because those are horrible people. Yeah. Ku Klux Klan, riding high, right? So that was going on in the 30s, and at the same time going on in the 30s was, well, it was the glory period of the American Communist Party, right? And labor was on the march, and whole factories, auto factories were being occupied. So it was tremendous polarization. And not only that, the 30s was the biggest period of progress in the first half of the 20th century. What's going on? So then I fast forwarded to the 60s. Well, that brings more of you in. Okay, so the 60s, what was going on in the 60s and 70s? Hey, there were families in which parents and children were not talking to each other. Talk about, right? Talk about polarization. There were ministers getting tossed out of their congregations. You remember? Some of you actually remember this. Yeah, yeah. Incredible polarization. Ku Klux Klan growing again like crazy. The Ku Klux Klan, you can watch it ebb and flow, right, over time. And that was one of its periods of growth. I was attending a demonstration in Washington, D.C. with my then wife, a Norwegian named Berit. Who is actually the reason why I wrote the book, because I went to Norway to marry her, and if I hadn't gone to Norway to marry her, I wouldn't have learned a thing about Norway, because it was like totally off my map, right? But there I was, learning the language, learning the culture, all of that, and of course, I I learned something, right? So, okay, so, and fortunately, she loved me back, and so we got married. And then we did decide to settle down here, and there I was in the mid-60s, and there was James Baldwin, on a street corner in D.C. speaking to a rally. It was we were all tightly together because we were trying to obey the traffic laws at that moment. And we were like hip to hip, just really listening to James Baldwin. And suddenly I feel the loss of pressure of her hip, and I look, and there she is falling toward the pavement. And I grab her just in time. She had fainted. And when she came to, I said, "Barrett, what's going on?" And she pointed in that direction. And I looked over there, and there were a group of American Nazis, and they were wearing swastikas. And she had not seen a swastika since occupied Norway, World War II, which was a traumatic experience, right? So she was triggered by that. Yeah, the 60s was a time of the Nazis growing and so on. And it was also a time of the Symbionese Liberation Army, you know, and just all kinds of amazing extreme things going on the left. We had this great polarization, but the 60s and 70s, breakthrough time again, right? Major steps forward. At last ending legalized segregation. At last dealing with some child labor issues that hadn't been dealt with in the 30s. Do you remember there were environmental steps forward? We stopped nuclear power, just all kinds of things. Medicare, we got Medicare. We'd gotten Social Security in the 30s, but then we got Medicare in the 60s and 70s, right? So the environmentalist movement, so many steps forward in a period of polarization. So I'm driven to the conclusion that polarization doesn't necessarily stop progress. So I was puzzling over this during this book tour I just came back from in England, and I was staying with a guy who was an artist, a metal sculptor, and he had to learn blacksmith skills in order to do that work. So he was showing me, you know, he took me into his workplace and stuff like that. I was in awe of all that. And then I remembered, I said, look, you need all that fire because the metal you work with won't be shaped unless you heat it up, right? And he said, you got it. And I said, there's the metaphor we've needed. Polarization is the fire that blacksmiths use and metal sculptors in order to shape something that otherwise could not be a horseshoe, right? Or could not be a gorgeous sculpture. The fire is necessary. Now that doesn't mean that polarization always has great results. Germany, at the same time as the Nordic countries, had tremendous polarization, right? And they went to Hitler. Italy, same period, right? And it was a fascist outcome, Mussolini. So it's not like the blacksmith's heat necessarily comes out with great horseshoes. You know, it could come out with some really miserable stuff too. So that then increased even more my interest in the Nordic countries. How did they pull it off? Since it was not a foreordained conclusion, it was not, the Germans didn't and the Italians didn't, and they had huge left movements, They weren't able to pull that off, but the Norway and Sweden did. So what were they doing right? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person who, when I run into a problem, I love to know how somebody else solved that problem because maybe I can copy what they did, and that's a shortcut to solving my problem. Does that make sense? Professionals call it best practices, right? So that's my approach to the Nordics. I'm not a slave to what they did, but I'm very curious about if they solved some problems, I want to know because maybe they'll work for me. Okay, so this is what they did. You thought I would never get to this part. I was hanging there in polarization for so long. But this is, too many pieces of paper. For one thing, they knew how to peel paper. And then for another thing, they did a number of very concrete things that were very, very smart and in contrast to what the German left and the Italian left did. First of all, they developed a vision of what they wanted that had broad appeal. They framed it in a way that made it a common sense vision. You didn't have to be an economist to subscribe to it, although the vision was created by economists as well as by ordinary people. But they created a vision that had enormous appeal. Now that's really different from trying to protest your way into a new society, right? I know some folks like that who go from one protest to another, to another, to another. And even there are some activists who could define themselves by the long list of protests they've been to, right? But I can't think of a single society in history that actually changed itself in a dramatic way through protest. Because backing away from what you don't want is a very different posture from going for what you do want. Career guidance counselors say, go for what you want, right? I had a daughter who was a competitive swimmer. Her coach was all about visualize you getting to the finish line. Visualize your stroke. You know, even visualize you at the other end of the pool making that really smooth turn. You know, visualize doing it rather than being grumpy about not doing it or protesting poor outcomes. So that's what they did. They focused on what it was they wanted. And that was one way that they got it. Took a lot of discussion, a lot of study groups, a lot of discussion to get to that place, but they got broad agreement on a vision. Next, they organized new economy institutions. Why did they do that? Well, for one thing, why wait till you've made the big change in order to get the goodies if you can get some of the goodies early, right? And I've already learned, thanks to one of you, about work that's going on about building a bank here in Salem that would be city-owned bank, and about credit unions and so on. Folks are at work in Oregon already doing this kind of thing. One reason why it really made sense for the Nordics was because they were very oppressed peoples, actually more oppressed probably than most of you in this room. They'd had centuries of being told that they didn't know anything, that they had to follow the leader, follow the direction of the economic elite. Those are the only people in the country who know how an economy works. And they felt really dumb. They just felt dumb. So what they needed was they needed to build institutions to get the positive feedback. Hey, we know something, right? The farmers who would create a cooperative dairy and then find, wow, we are keeping more of our wealth from all of this hard work we're doing with our dairy cows, you know, and we're surplus at the end of the year. How about that? And we're sharing the wealth with each other. And wow, this is working way better than that capitalist dairy was. So maybe the capitalists don't know everything about an economy. So it was that kind of thing that helped people get feisty enough to take on the experts. Because the experts will always try to make you feel dumb when you confront them, right? And having some practical, positive experience with alternatives is emboldening for you, empowering for you. Another thing they did, they had campaigns. Campaigns, campaigns, campaigns. And they preferred to do their campaigns directly engaging the economic elite because they had seen through their pretend democracies. Now, mind you, they all had parliaments and free elections, pretty free elections, but somehow or other, no matter how the majority felt, it was the economic elite that got its way. Now, you wouldn't know any country that's like that at all, but that was how it was over there. And so the thing was that they saw through it. They decided, we're not going to go romancing members of parliament all the time and imagining that they're going to do what we want. Because we know they're accountable to somebody else. They're not accountable to us. They're accountable to the economic elite. So we are going to instead not go after the middleman. We're going to go after the economic elite themselves. So we're going to have campaigns that are addressed to them. Of course, this also goes on in the U.S. right now, and I'm proud to say I'm part of an activist group in the East that is doing exactly that. We're called Earthquaker Action Team. I'm a Quaker, and we call ourselves Earthquaker because we want to be earthquaking in our impact. And of course, we're Action Team because we do action campaigns. And we're team because, I don't know if you know Quakers, but there are a lot of Quakers who are afflicted with a disease called individualism. You know, how can I be more unique and eccentric than anybody else? And so we wanted to really, really emphasize team, team, team. So we called it Equate, equate.org, Equate Earthquaker Action Team. Okay, so what did we do? We decided our first campaign, and we were, a lot of the people in the group were newbies, right? But our first campaign was going to stop mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia by going after the bank that was the biggest financer of mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. That's where you blow up the mountain in order to get the coal. Unbelievable. 500 mountains had already been blown up when we started our campaign, right? So the bank that was the leading culprit was the 7th largest bank in the country. It hasn't gotten to the West Coast yet, but it's coming, watch out. It's moving west, and it's called PNC Bank, and it was the #1 financer. And so we thought we'd take it on. We started in a living room. Some friends of mine called and said, George, now you really have lost your mind. You're going after the 7th largest bank in the country. For one thing, now that Obama is in office, he surely doesn't want to blow up mountains. So just do more pressure through the EPA, you know, and your Congress people and so on. And we said, that's the middleman. We're going after the perpetrators. We're going after the ones that Obama is accountable to, right? One of his first acts was to appoint Tim Geithner to be his Treasury Secretary, because after all, he had to show Wall Street, you can't govern in this country without Wall Street's permission. So he had to show Wall Street, I will be loyal to you, and Tim Geithner is my Treasury guy. That's how it works, right? So we understand that's how it works, so we are going after the bank. So, yeah, right, well, good luck. Okay, so we grew from a living room size group to 13 states, and we drove them out of the business. We drove the bank out of the business. What satisfaction. So now we have our second campaign. And as soon as we announced we were doing a second campaign, lots of new people came. And she said, oh, what are you doing here? Yeah, I mean, I've known you for a long time, but you haven't been with us on the first campaign. Yeah, but you guys are winners. Oh, right, winning matters. And it's not like you have to win every campaign to be a winner, but it does matter if you're trying as a new group, you know, to build credibility. It's very nice to win. And in fact, we chose our first goal thinking we could win it. So, okay, so campaigns. Now, a very cool thing about campaigns is that you can add campaigns to it. Examples. The anti-nuclear power movement, right? All over the country, campaigns, right? The pipeline movement, fossil fuel pipelines, campaigns all over the place. The sit-in movement for students. Can you picture 4 students in the South going downtown and sitting in and asking for coffee, 4 black students? Now they knew a protest was not going to do it. They were going to have to campaign, which meant that the next day they were going to have to come down, and the next day they were going to have to come, right? And so they did their campaign, which started to grow. Over the next county, another historically black college, students like very alert because they played them in football. Oh my gosh, they're doing that. Well, if they could do that, we could do that, right? So then they had to go do their lunch counter and so on and so on. Next, very, very quickly, actually, it spread across the South. So there are multiple campaigns. Some lost, some won. But the movement won. Just as with the nuclear power struggle, some won, some lost, but the movement won. My prediction is that will happen with the pipeline fight. Some win, some lose, yes, and we will win. We will shut down the pipelines. The second largest, by the way, the second largest, while I was in Europe just 2 weeks ago, the second largest bank of Europe announced that it is giving up financing any pipelines that carry fracked gas. Yeah. So Paribas. some 3 initials in Paribus. I forget the initials. Okay, so that's the nature of campaigns. You get a campaign plus other campaigns, multiple campaigns. What you get is a movement. We can call it a pipeline or movement or whatever. The issue is, okay, however, the thing is that the more success that you're having in building that movement and that movement, the more possible it becomes then to imagine building a movement of movements. That's what we got in the 60s and 70s. We got a movement of movements. It was crystallized most clearly in terms of incarnated when Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington in 1963 and called it the March for Jobs and Justice, or Jobs and Freedom. And there were all those white trade unionists, right? And all those black people, and historically black colleges, all those youngsters came up from the South. It was just this amazing, broad batch of movements working together to do that march. It was terrifying at the time for the economic elite. They were very, very worried about it. John Kennedy told the workers in government in D.C. to stay home. He expected it was Armageddon or something, you know, like the end of the world, because what he understood to be happening was a movement of movements. That's when they sweat. So I think that's what we go for. Okay? But how do you get a movement of movements to exist? There you are in your campaign, somebody else is in their campaign, you're building your new economy institutions and so on. How do you get it? It's back to the beginning. That's an essential step. The movement of movements grows from agreement with the vision. Follow me? Because again, it's the positivity of a vision. This is the society we want. This is the society we deserve, right? That's what makes fundamental change possible, and that's what makes it possible for movements who will have their differences of all kinds, right? Able to say, but at least we unite on this vision, this broad platform. Good news on that front. The good news is that the movement for Black Lives has already gotten the ball rolling. August 1st, 2016, New York Times and other major organs, The Guardian, paid considerable attention to it, because that's when Movement for Black Lives said, here is a vision. Please unite with this. So when that came out, there were tears in my eyes, because I was very influenced by Bayard Rustin, one of the architects of the civil rights movement, Dr. King's main strategist and so on, an amazing African-American, Quaker, gay man, just charismatic and brilliant, and every time he was anywhere near, I was sitting at his feet. I was a youngin', right? Like, tell me more, tell me more. Okay, well, I heard Bayard say over and over and over, look, if we can't get this economic justice thing right, we being the civil rights movement, if we can't get that right, in 50 years, we're still going to have ugly racism. He was right. He was right. He understood that the economy and racism are very, very embedded. For one thing, the economy uses racial difference in order to keep people divided, right, so that they can continue in power. But also the economic institutions embed racism in multiple ways that it works day by day. So that's got to be cracked. Okay, so I have Bayard in my mind as I'm reading as I go online. By the way, this is online, Movement for Black Lives. So I go online and I'm reading the provisions and I think, what would Bayard say? What would Bayard say? Whoa, lots of economic provisions in it. So they were up for cracking the economic nut. So exciting. So then my second question, still very immersed in the research I'd done for the book, well, do these economic provisions that they're proposing, are they basically fantasy? You know, wouldn't it be wonderful if, or wouldn't it be wonderful if? Or are these economic policies ones that are in alignment with historic track record of the Nordic countries, because they have the best track record?
And the answer is yes, they do. The economic provisions in the Movement for Black Lives vision are in alignment with the Nordic vision. Which means, therefore, that they have tremendous credibility because with the Nordic economic model having 60 years plus of successful performance, exceeding the performance of the United States. And when I was in Britain, I was saying, exceeding the performance of Britain. We are talking about, this is top drawer. This is the top of the line. If you want a good economy, if you want a brilliant economy, go the Nordic way. Well, and if you want an economy that's going to give us a chance to deal with racism, go the Nordic way. Wow, that was like, I cried. Because it's been so long that I've been wanting to see this. And here it comes from the black community, from that insurgency, you know, that keeps going when black people are killed on the streets by, and in their homes even, by white police officers. It's that insurgency. People pulled together. I know one of the people who was involved with that and said, let's create what we want so we can go for it. Now, every one of your groups, I'm guessing that a lot of you are associated with groups, every one of your groups can go online, read the thing together, and endorse it. How about that? How about accepting the initiative taken by our black sisters and brothers, those of us who are white, and saying, okay, we're signing up. That might be really different from white people organizing something and then saying, hey, people of color, come on over here. Join us. Which doesn't work very well, right? No. How about we reverse the flow? How about we notice where the energy is and say, hey, there's the energy, we want to join you. And create a vision that will enable this kind of sequence to happen, that will enable all of us to live in a just society, using the heat of polarization to propel us forward. So, wow, do I have any time? 2 minutes. A bursting question. Any bursting questions? Yes?
So, so the step of engaging the economic elites, was that done through protests or through?
Campaigns. It was done through direct action campaigns. It was done through, what they had. Of course, this depends on the society, what your pressure points are. So in those societies, because they were industrializing, pressure points were the workers forming unions and striking. So it was strike, 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 strike against shipbuilders, against textile, you know, all these different kind of companies. So they were doing that quite a lot. And another pressure point that was given by history, this is a way in which each society is specific because different pressure points in different countries, like we have the pipelines, but they didn't have the pipelines. So, but what they had was, right, industrial strikes. Another big thing they had was farmers refusing to allow neighbor farms from being auctioned off. Now we had that here too, right, at the same time. When the bank would foreclose, because farmers, this is depression time, right? Farmers couldn't keep up their payments. Bank would foreclose, send the sheriff to auction off the farm, in order that the bank could get its, could get some money out of it. And then the neighboring farmers would all come and prevent the auction. Joined sometimes by students from the universities that understood, wait a minute, if we want a decent Norway, we're going to have to get in there with the workers and the farmers and be helpful. And so they would also show up. So that was another point of protest, and in that case, the banks, while in other cases it would be the shipbuilders and so on. Yes?
You mentioned you guys put the bank out of business, so it's funding the mountaintop removal. How exactly did you do that? Can you explain further on what you use?
Oh, yes. We had such fun coming up with tactics because it was our first time out. One thing we did was called up Rainforest Action Network, which has a lot of experience with banks and they're a very strong environmentalist organization. We said, hey, we're newbies. Would you be our big sister? Like, you have a research department, we don't, and so on and so on. And they thought we were cute, so they said, okay, we'll be your big sister. So we would call them for advice on inner workings of banks because we were learning as fast as we could. But we thought it's our job to innovate tactics. Now, a fun thing about innovating tactics is to tap the culture of your own background. So we thought, okay, well, we're Quakers, and part of our background, though, is part of our heritage is as Americans. Well, what's more American than a holdup, a bank holdup? Right? I mean, we've all seen that in movies and stuff, right? I mean, that's really like essential American culture is holding up banks. So what we need is a Quaker holdup. But how do you do a Quaker holdup? So we brainstormed and brainstormed. So this is what we came up with. You know, banks often have branches, right? This bank had branches all over the place. So we would walk into a branch, single file, it could be as few as a dozen or as many as 20. And we would circle up on the big marble floor, you know, in the lobby, and we would sit down and start worshiping. Well, I don't know if you've been a bank teller, but do you think you would do business while there's a worship service going on, you know, a few yards from you? And do you think as a customer, like you, what is this? You know, so naturally the bank branch manager is going crazy. You know, it's telling security guards, get those people out of there. Security guards coming, you have to get out of here. We'd say, no, you can't arrest us either because we know it takes police to do that. We're sitting here, we're worshiping. So, and we'd be giving testimony and singing and singing Peter's songs and stuff. And so, oh my God, what to do? We'll have to call the police. So they'd call the police. So the police would come. Sometimes we would be fine with getting arrested, so the police would lead us out. And other times in handcuffs. And other times we didn't have enough people ready to be arrested, so we would just go when the police would. So so first we would do one by one, and then as we grew, we could do 3 at a time simultaneously, you know, and then 5 in 5 different states, you know, and then more and more, and then 16 in one city at the same time, their headquarters city. That really drove them crazy. How could they do 16 banks at the same time? And they were so unready. And so some banks just closed when they saw us coming. Whoa, whoa, here come the Quakers. We closed the banks, you know, whoa, who knew? Who knew the Quakers were so scary? I mean, my friends don't think Quakers are scary, but the banks, they go, oh no, the Quakers are coming, the Quakers are coming. You know, so, oh God, it was such fun. So we finally got to the point where in 13 states we could have simultaneous bank holdups. And it was just tremendous. And we shut down their shareholders meetings, and we just did all these like really, really feisty things. A 200-mile walk to their headquarters, and just all these different things. Had a great time. So tactics, being creative with tactics is of course very helpful. And I would just encourage people to look into their own culture and ask, well, what's weird that we could do that would really take the whole thing, right? This is like balancing. It's like martial arts or something, you know? It's like throwing the opponent off balance by doing things that they're not expecting, and they never knew what to expect from us. Last question, I think.
What's the nexus between that and actually getting them to stop funding the mountaintop?
Oh, because from their point of view, I mean, we didn't do leafleting on the street and stuff. Our focus was on the CEO and the board of directors. And probably the CEO had a few key vice presidents, right? That was really the power group that would make the decision. So we were constantly communicating to them. We even spotlighted them. If they got an award from a chamber of commerce, we would be there to denounce that CEO or that, you know, do you know what his bank is doing? Oh my God, it was so exciting. So so from their point of view, the point of view of the top, all they could see was this little feisty group that was growing and growing and growing. It's like a cancer. It was just no stopping this group. And as far as they could see into the future, we would just keep growing into their footprint. I guess they had about 30 states by then. We would just keep growing and growing and becoming more and more disruptive. And it was too much. We were out of control. They could not control us. They tried various things, you know, to pacify us, and we wouldn't be pacified. So all they could see was endless trouble unless they gave up financing mountaintop removal coal mining. They preferred to give it up because they didn't want endless trouble. So it's one book calls it divine troublemaking. And we have run out of time. But I'm hoping that I've planted some seeds with this set of ideas. That actually it's not rocket science. Other countries have done this. They've developed a vision. Now, we have avoided that up till now, except for the Black Lives Matter movement. But we can get into their vision and create a specific vision for Oregon as well. We can do this. None of this is actual rocket science, but inviting diversity of people into the act is going to create more innovative tactics, right? And more attractive tactics. And because the vision keeps you positive, then it's not a question, nobody will join my group because, why? I mean, we are usually depressed, it's true. You know, but instead, you know, but I keep running. I recently keynoted a statewide meeting of environmentalists, and I said, I've already talked with a bunch of you who say what you do for your monthly internal education meetings is that you show films of seas rising and, you know, disasters and so on, and then your members go away, you know, and then some of them come back the next week. What is it? You know, and church basements full of depressed people. Come on, we want a movement. So I said, why are you doing this to your members? Your members already know there's climate change, or they wouldn't have come to your meeting. So they know it already. Who are you trying to convince? So instead, teach them what a social change movement looks like that succeeds. So Earthquake Reaction Team, we watched the movie Pride. We've watched it twice from Britain. Fantastic, fantastic movie. We've watched the Act Up movie about how lesbians and gays just, you know, crunched the pharmaceutical movement and the pharmaceutical industry and the government. We watched the civil rights movements. There are more and more available that are really good, especially Selma. I recommend Selma very highly. Please don't let a week go by without seeing Selma. And when you feed your membership with films that show people succeeding, your membership will succeed. If you keep showing your members how to fail, they will probably do that because many of them are rule followers and they will fail if you want them to. But don't do that. How about that? Stop depressing people. If there's one thing I've learned, I'm 79 years old, if there's one thing I've learned in all these years of activism since I was 12, it's stop depressing people, right? I mean, we can do so much better because the spirit inside us that enlivens us for this work is not about depression. It's not. It's visionary. It's hope. It's about God. It's about power. It's about truth. It's about life. Let's express that. Thank you very much. Great, great. So you've heard Peter say that he noticed a lot of things, a lot of overlap, a lot in common. How many of you noticed that as people were reporting? Yeah, I did too. It was really, really striking. And I kept asking myself, as I was seeing the displays, kept asking myself, well, are there things here that are contradictory to other things? Because after all, that's one of the ways that people are separated, right? Well, if we get what you lot want, then that would be to the disadvantage of you lot, right? And therefore separate the population and have us fighting each other. But I didn't see radically incompatible things that were up there. You agree? So looks good, right? So the economic elite's going to say, yeah, let's do that. Thank you, people of Oregon, for pointing out what we. You're laughing.
They always do.
They always do, right? Right. There's a quote from Warren Buffett, billionaire Warren Buffett, that we need to know in order to put this in perspective. In 2008, Warren Buffett, how many of you know his name, the Warren Buffett name? Yeah. I mean, he's really a kind of guru, right? And I have a lot of respect for him myself. I think he's really, really smart. And he was interviewed by Ben Stein, it was like the awesome opportunity for a journalist to sit down and ask all kinds of questions of this guy. And Ben Stein worked for the New York Times. He could say, Mr. Buffett, what do you think of this? Mr. Buffett, what do you think of that? And so he said at one point, Mr. Buffett, there are some people in our country who are saying that there's such a thing as class war. What do you think of that? And Warren Buffett said, well, of course there's class war. And my class, the rich, started it. And we're winning. Word for word, that's what he said. And the New York Times printed it. Now, he's been known before to tell tales out of school. Buffett has been. But this is, I think, a kind of headline description of what's been going on for quite a while. I think he's dating this current offensive that they've been on with the 1980 Ronald Reagan period, when you may remember one of his first acts, shooting a shot across the bow of the labor movement, was to fire the air traffic controllers. You remember that? Yeah. And that was boom. And one result of that was that the labor movement went on the defensive. But that's not all. The major movements of that period all went on defensive. The women's movement did, actually, and so did the civil rights movement, and so did the environmental movement. Major movements that had been in the 60s and 70s going like mad went on the defensive in the sense of trying to hold on to what had already been achieved. The peace movement did not. But most of them did. And the result was that they lost ground. All the major movements, except peace movement and also LGBTQ, trans, that group of dissenters to the reigning paradigm with regard to sexuality and gender, they did not go on the defensive. In fact, during the AIDS period, remember the 80s, they increased, they escalated with regard to Ronald Reagan and against the pharmaceuticals. That was another situation where it was the economic elite that was keeping things in place and creating death. And they succeeded, but then they didn't stop and say, okay, now we've done enough because the economic elite says we should shut up. No, now we want equal marriage, remember? And then now we want equality in the military. And now it's about the bathrooms. It's thing after thing after thing after thing, always on the offensive, whereas the other major movements went on the defensive. And you can see the results of that. Now, Gandhi didn't always agree with military generals, but Gandhi and military generals agreed strategically on this principle, that you never win on the defensive. You win on the offensive. And therefore, we need to keep pushing forward and setting new goals that we go after. And that's what the LGBT people did. And that's why they were successful, even at a time when Warren Buffett's class was pushing like crazy to push other groups back. So we, therefore, can learn a tremendous lot about how to get all this. We can go on the offensive instead of going on the defensive. Now, the Democrats are busy going on the defensive to preserve Obamacare, right? Bernie Sanders started to go down that path, a defeatist path based on experience, based on strategy thinking. Fortunately, he changed his mind and said, oh, right, we do actually want single-payer health care. We do want Medicare for all. Thank God. I thought, oh my gosh, we even lost Bernie. He's become a Democrat. Why people even bother to pay attention to Democrats for strategic thinking, I do not know, because they are such losers. Bernie realized, oh my gosh, yes, that's right. It was Medicare for all that I wanted, so maybe I should go back to that, right? But he's the exception in Washington. Most of those guys are trying to defend the things that we already got. And therefore, that's a losing strategy. I mean, we even have folklore about that. We have folk wisdom called the best defense is... So next time a friend of yours says, oh, now they're threatening that. Let's defend it. Let's call our movement resistance. Note that word, resistance. You resist when somebody else has the initiative, right? They're after you, and then you romantically resist and get points for martyrdom or something. Right? Okay, so we have to understand, Warren Buffett, speaking out of school, revealed what's been going on since 1980. Now, we can either go with that, go on the defensive, try to retain something or other, and lose, and forget forever the work that you did. But the work that you did is supported, I have in the book, poll after poll after poll shows a majority of Americans want the kinds of things that you folks put up there. So you are not aberrant. Please don't think of yourselves as marginal, hardcore activists. I've been in this for 40 years, whatever, you know. So I must be different from my neighbors and the people in my church and so on and so on. Please, with regard to this vision work, you folks are so amazingly mainstream. So it's time to step into that and say, okay, we are representative, we're a slice, but we are representative of a broader wish on the part of the American people to have what, well, one shorthand is, to have what the Nordics have. We deserve it as much as they do, we should have it, and we should fight for it. And that's our opportunity. So this afternoon is the opportunity to figure out then how specifically do you go after those things, right? But you could do it with a new confidence because of the work of your morning. You can do it with the sense of, oh, we are some people in the church basement, and we represent a very large body of wish, of hope, of aspiration. But many of those people outside this room are near giving up, are carrying a lot of despair around, right? Are baffled by the polarization and thinking things are stuck. I already showed you this morning that's not at all the case. The fire is here. We're warmed up. We have the gift of Trump as an alarm clock, waking up. Many people who, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, would be sleeping right this moment. Right? So we have so much going for us now. The question that Peter wants us to address this afternoon is, and how do we implement? How do we implement? One final point I'd like to make in order to expand your sense of what's available. And that is this. It's also on your handout. Think bigger than you may have been thinking in terms of who's available to work with in your community. I know you come from a variety of places, not only from Salem, and notice that according to Bill Moyer, a social movement scholar and a strategist, not the broadcaster, but the strategist, successful social movements have all four of these roles. So take a new look at your community. Take a new look at your organization, at your neighborhood, because you may have been focusing on the rebels. The rebels are the troublemakers, like my group, Earthquaker Action Team. Not long ago, there was an old friend of mine who was so excited about our having won the first campaign. She said, now I want to join the second campaign, George. You folks rock. You're amazing. And I want to bring my money. She was a person who had quite a lot of money. She's an internationally known person. I won't use her name, but she has a lot of money. She knows a lot of people with money. She was saying, I'm going to bring a lot of people in my living room. We're going to raise a lot of money for you. This is an awesome new campaign that you folks have designed, and so on and so on. I won't take time to describe it, but you can, equate.org is our website, so you can go on and see our new campaign. She said, I want to be right in there with you. And I said, Judy, I'm not sure. What do you mean you're not sure? Aren't you my friend? Yes, yes, yes. I love you. We'll keep having lunch. But I see you as an advocate. An advocate. Huh. Well, an advocate is different from a rebel in that a rebel makes change by making trouble. An advocate makes change by going to authority. Like going to the power elite, going to politicians, and representing people that want change, right? I said, I actually see you as more of an advocate than a rebel. We're a rebel crowd. That's what we do. We are troublemakers. You, though, are so good and so clear in the way you talk to people in immense authority, and you are totally unscared of anybody, no matter, it could be the president. And she said, well, I do happen to know the CEO of the corporation you're going after. I was not surprised. I was not surprised. Okay, I said, Judy, look, if you affiliated with us, your name, you'd lose your credibility with him, and so on and so on. So we'll keep having lunch. I'll tell you what we're doing. You tell me what you're doing. But go after the CEO on your own behalf. Be an advocate. Yeah, the helpers are the people who like to do direct service. They like to be right in there. If it's poverty, then let's go right in there with those tiny houses or, whatever. Let's say. Very, very direct service, right? They show up in every social movement. Their style is to do direct stuff that eases the problems that are created by the economic elite. The organizer is somebody who wants a room full of people and on the street wants twice as many as the last time we're on the street, right? So it often doesn't matter that much what an organizer's organizing. Is to get a lot of people out there doing it with a great confidence that with more people we will succeed. And of course they're right. With more people we are more likely to succeed. So all four of these make their contribution, but they may show up in different ways. Now, the reason why I explain this scheme to you is not only because I want you to be able to see people more clearly back where you are, like I was able to get Judy, Judy's contribution was different from say mine, but also because in many communities, these people fight with each other about what's important, or at least compete. Am I right? Right? So the rebel will sneer at the helper, mere social work, or you're just a teacher. Get out here and fight. Get arrested, whatever. And the organizer, well, why are you being so chummy, with your congressperson or your state representative, always going to see them? I think you ought to go with about 150 people, right? Or something big to organize. Right? And so you can have a lot of unnecessary competition when all four roles are useful in successful social movements. So what can come out of this as you make your plans for what you're going to do back home is a big affirmation for everybody the way they show up. You don't need to compete. If you're saying, well, in my community we don't have enough rebels, then go after the rebels. And as you talk with them, somebody will show up, oh, well, they're your helper. Well, God bless you, be a helper. Goodbye. Keep in touch, and so on, like that. Does that make sense? Good. Question?
I think I mostly come from a nonviolent point of view, but I'm starting to find some folks starting to take more the side of Antifa and wanting to get more violent. And I don't know how to deal with that.
Okay, were you able to hear in the back that she runs into folks who are very concerned about the growth of fascism and white supremacy and would like to stifle that and push that back in the corner, right? And are willing to do it violently in order to keep them from expressing themselves, keep them from holding meetings, that kind of thing. Is that right? I think we saw that in Portland not that long ago, right? So the Antifa people, whose political identity is, I'm primarily an anti-fascist. That's what I primarily am. And wherever they show up, that's where I want to be in order to contest the space with them. Right. So that's, yes?
There are some of those groups that are doing fun things like being clowns and making fun of the fascists.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are others who are actually taking on violence.
Right, right. Well, I'm hoping that you will so fall in love with visioning and with ways of campaigning and building and working for the vision that you won't let yourself be distracted by the fascists. Because they, based on the experience in Norway and Sweden, are a big distraction from the main work that needs to be done. That is, you can get yourself so caught up in, well, it's us versus them, that the power elite, they're up there saying, oh, how nice. Right? The economic elite can be delighted. You just have as much street fighting as you want, or clowning, for that matter, because you don't touch us when you fight each other. We especially love it when you take on white working class men, because we're scared of white working class men. They sometimes in history have been a big problem for us. So if they turn up in a fascist guise and you fight with them, that's wonderful. Then we don't have to pay the police to do it. So be aware. That wonderful song from the Civil Rights Movement, keep your eye on the prize. Is the Civil Rights Movement known mainly for fighting the Ku Klux Klan? No. Well, the Ku Klux Klan was there. I mean, they practically ran entire southern states where the Civil Rights Movement was. Well, why didn't Dr. King and all those colleagues drop their fight for integration and spend their time fighting the Ku Klux Klan? Well, they knew a trap when they saw it. Same with Norway and Sweden. The left movements there, one reason why Norway and Sweden did not go the route of Germany and Italy was because in Germany and Italy, the left got totally distracted by the fascists. And they had street fight after street fight. They would go to each other's taverns and bait each other and then come out and fight or smash up the tavern. That's what was going on in Germany and Italy. And it got more and more chaotic. There was more and more violence. And the people in the middle started clamoring to the government, we want law and order. This is intolerable. It's even insecure to go to the street now because there's all these hooligans or whatever, and they weren't necessarily distinguishing between the left and the right, right? It was just what they saw was violence, violence, violence. In other words, what the Antifa people were doing in Germany and Italy was strengthening the state by increasing the power of the argument of the people in the middle. State, come on and save us. Do your law and order thing. And we know what they did in Germany. The economic elite handed it over to Hitler. And in Italy, the economic elite handed the country over to Mussolini. So the Antifa contributed toward the fascist growth in Europe. Exactly the opposite of what they intended to do. Whereas in Norway and Sweden, they didn't take the bait. Hey, you can bait me as much as you want. You know, come on out. Yeah, George, we'll get you, we'll get you. Come on out, come on. Well, I'm busy doing something else. I'm doing something else called social change. I'm doing something else called pursuing my vision of justice. And that's what they decided to do in Norway and Sweden, and that's why they went ahead. That's one reason why they went ahead and changed their societies instead of getting distracted. So that's my response to Mark Bray. I can hardly wait. Mark Bray, the author of the new book, Antifa. I know him. He's an author for the same from the same publisher as I am, and we hope to have a dialogue, a public dialogue, so that we can argue this out. Yes?
I have a question about this. So I totally agree with you.
vision.
Yeah.
And some of them are advocating violence. So in my mind, there's two things. I believe strongly in nonviolence. My group strongly believes in nonviolence. But we also are trying to ally with groups, especially groups of people of color. So I'm not sure if that was the tenor of your question too. How do you work across the difference of violence versus nonviolence towards an overall working part? Am I making sense?
Right, right. Yes, you're making...
It applies to other things. What do you do with an ally group that is doing something that your group really doesn't believe in or agree with, and yet we're all working towards the same thing?
Yeah. We've been through it. We've been through it in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. We've been through it in the anti-war movement in the 60s. So we've been through it over and over with the Black Panthers and just all kinds of groups. And do your best to get to know them if you don't know them already, and negotiate agreements such that they're doing their violent thing over in that part of town while you're doing your nonviolent thing in this part of town. That is, make as clear a distinction as you can, because you can be sure that the economic elite will want to mush you together and use the violence perpetrated by the violent group as an excuse to put you down. That's what they do over and over and over. They get permission from the middle to oppress you, to suppress you on the grounds that you are causing violence, but actually it's another gang. So you need to separate. And that can be done in a comradely way. You don't need to get all self-righteous on them. You know, you understand that. Yes?
In Norway and Sweden, did they create a new party? Is that what we're talking about doing? Or are we talking about changing the Democratic Party?
Well, they waited to organize a political party to go into Parliament when after they had already gotten in place the instruments of the power shift, which is the direct action campaigns and the new economy stuff. So once they got that underway, then they created a political party to represent them and made it totally accountable to them.
So we're talking about creating our own party.
You'd need to, because the Democratic Party isn't accountable, cannot be accountable to you. It is already bought and sold, it's bought and owned by the economic elite. So that's who they're accountable to. We're late to the store, it was already bought. So we have to create a party that's accountable to us. That's the only kind of party worth our putting our time into, in my view.
Well, then how do you add de la Fier's law of political science into that, which says, according to our Constitution and the way the arithmetic works, we will only ever have two parties in this country? Then
we'll have to push one of the parties out. That's happened before in American history. So one party will have to make way for the party that represents us. But we're a long way from that point because we don't yet have a mobilized mass movement that's ready to organize a party to represent us. The thing to notice about the Democrats, though, there is this division of labor. One reason it's been such a stable arrangement, these two parties, is because the Republicans' job, functionally, has been to suppress us, and the Democrats' job, historically, has been to co-opt us. And so the Civil Rights Movement was making great gains as long as it stayed independent. That's why you have to watch Selma. You will get to see that in action. And then when it lost its independence and allowed the Democratic Party to embrace it, it also lost its steam. And that happens over and over and over. I stated that recently in a keynote that I gave to a state assembly of many, many, many people that included 4 elected officials. And I just said what I just said now. The 4 elected officials were all running for office, Democratic office. 2 of them were running for governor of that particular state. I won't name the state. And so they were in the audience, and I was reminding people, if they, or maybe it was news to people, that the job of the Democrats is to co-opt them and tame and domesticate them and prevent them from getting anything like this vision that you want. And that's what I was pointing out. So I was wondering what these elected officials would think, right? So then it was break time. 2 of them come barreling toward me, both of them governor candidates, right? And one said, Half of me thinks you're right. But I'm just playing this game for now because I think I can do some good. I said, I understand. The other guy, the other person came over, the first was a woman, the other person came over, he had spent already 6 years as Speaker of the House of that legislature, right? So this was a very, very experienced politician. And was he ever smooth? And he was so telegenic and, oh my gosh, I think he'll be the next governor of that state. So he comes over and he smiles and he says, George, I just want to own it. You're right. That's what we do. We co-opt grassroots movements and then control them, and they can't get what they want. That's what we do. I thought, wow, you are a good politician. Yes.
Okay, this is kind of a hard question.
I know you want to
The
stop.
population in Norway is about 5 million today, and it's probably been less at the time that your book is referring to. So can you connect the dots between that size of a population that may have in fact, they're concentrated, down in Oslo and they're concentrated. So we have different circumstances. Is this still applicable?
Yeah, I do in the last chapter of the book address many of those kinds of questions. I think they're great questions. I had those things on my mind as a researcher also, and I learned a lot about it. One thing I got to realize was that systems that work, for example, in tiny Iceland, right, 320,000, like Social Security, also works fine in the United States. Social Security, what would we do without it? I mean, our version is stingy, their version is generous, but as a system, it works fine, right? Medicare, again, there was great opposition to both Social Security and Medicare as this weird European import that would never work, right? With regard to Medicare, studies show that people on Medicare give higher approval ratings than people on private health insurance. And Medicare, hey, that's the system used in the Nordic countries, except more generous and total. And here, it's used only partly and less generous, but it works as a system. So I think there are probably economic things that don't scale up. There probably are. But there are things that do scale up. So I don't let the scale question worry me.
That wasn't
Yeah.
my question. My question was whether the developing movement is possible on this.
Got it. That's a different question, right? We do have a bunch of things going for us now that they didn't have then. One thing is social media can be amazing. The day after the inauguration, 4 million, 5 million people showed up, and I was told that was 2 weeks worth of work or something. I mean, that must have been 24 hours a day, but anyway, it was social media like boom, and 5 million people show up, right? There's no way the people of those countries could have produced anything like that percentage of their people in 2 weeks because communication means were just really, really limited. They had a lot of limitations. They didn't have nonviolence training. In fact, they didn't even have the concept of nonviolence, really. They just didn't want to do what the Russians had done. So they're kind of backing into their nonviolent revolution. But they didn't have anything like political scientists' understanding now of nonviolent struggle. Now, because of political science studies, it's possible to say, hey, look, if you're starting a movement, this is a good thing, by the way, to say to your friends who are interested in violence these days. It's possible now to say, hey, look, you want to do this movement, you have a choice between violence and nonviolence, you'll improve your chances by double. You'll double your chances of success by choosing nonviolence. That's what the studies now show. So there's just all kinds of knowledge that we now have about organizing and about action that the Nordics did not have. And I think we ought to use those advantages and make it possible for us to do stuff. Well, Peter's reminding me that you all have small group work to do. Should I take just one question more and then let it go? Because I know you've been wanting to get into it.
I want to play devil's advocate. Actually,
cool.
I don't know if it's devil's advocate because you might want to have that as a role in there. But,
or rebel.
It's really what I believe in devil's advocate. were great advances made by the Democrats during the New Deal. I don't need to outline them. There were great advances made under Lyndon Johnson.
Exactly.
With pressure from below.
Exactly.
In some cases.
I've already referred to that, the 30s and the 60s, 70s. Yes.
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 Bernie Sanders came closer to success in terms of winning than Ralph Nader did outside of the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And in Scandinavia, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know the political history as well as you do, but it was a Labor Party, which is pretty standard in Western European countries, and comparable to our Democratic Party. Look at the struggle in Great Britain.
Not comparable at all. No.
Look at the struggle in Great Britain for the heart and soul of the Labor Party between, the Tony Blairs versus the Jeremy Corbyns.
I understand.
Okay. So how can you say that the Democratic Party is a lost cause when it may be the only way that we can get power in America?
Because the Labor Party of the Scandinavian countries was set up to be strictly accountable to the movement that created it. Strictly accountable. And the labor movement. The labor movement created the Labor Party, the farmers movement created the Farmers Party, and both of those were in an alliance, and they were both accountable to their constituents, which means that if you were an MP and got your own ideas, MPs are notorious for getting their own ideas, right? And they're the wrong ideas from the point of view of the labor movement, then boom, you're out. That was not true of the labor movement in Britain. Constitutionally, it was not created to be accountable and has not been accountable, and that's why Blair could exist. And also that is anything but true in the Democratic Party, which is totally owned and controlled by the economic elite. Totally owned and controlled by the economic elite, and has been for a long time. But the more money that flushes through the electoral process, of course, the more it is the case that the Democrats are accountable to and beholden to the economic elite. So there's no reason to expect, I mean, Bernie Sanders, if he had somehow gotten into the Oval Office, he would have had a tenure like Jimmy Carter's, who also had aspirations when he became president, sat there, did crocheting or knitting or something, probably built a couple of houses for Habitat, because nobody paid attention to him. He was isolated. He got nothing done. Bernie Sanders, I'm so glad he lost, because he's too valuable to spend getting massages or whatever in the Oval Office, waiting for 4 years to be over. We just have to get, this is my last point and we have to go, we have to get way more realistic about the power, the nature of power in this country than we want to be. It's not the way we want it to be. It's not the way the civics textbooks in middle school taught it was. It is really the economic elite that runs things here. That's who we have to understand as the enemy, and we have to push them out. And the good news is we can, but we can only do it if we understand what we're doing. And that is the job we have waiting for us. Peter's going to get us to do it.